The following program is Part 3, the conclusion of a pdxjustice Media Productions From the Archives lecture, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. The date is March 15, 1989. Our speaker is Noam Chomsky, Professor of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Parts 1 and 2 of this lecture are available as streaming video through our website at www.pdxjustice.org. We look back at this lecture, delivered over 15 years ago, for insights into where we find ourselves today. Of particular interest are Professor Chomsky's discussion of Zionism, the so-called pro-Israel lobby, and the strategic asset theory of U.S. support for Israel's continuing occupation and settlement of Palestinian land. This entire lecture will be broadcast in 3 one-hour programs. The first program, Part 1, included most of the lecture. The second program, Part 2, concluded the lecture and covered most of the question and answer session from Professor Chomsky's presentation. This final program, Part 3, will complete the question and answer session and will conclude with a commentary by Bashir Abu Meneh discussing the relevance of this From the Archive lecture to the ongoing struggle for peace and for justice in the Middle East. And now, Part 3 of Professor Chomsky's presentation, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, a lecture from the archives, March 15, 1989. The lecture was delivered at the Wisconsin Union Theater on the Madison campus of the University of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Okay. I would question your thesis that the United States' support for Israel has mainly been due to U.S. interests. And, for instance, Israel really has no oil resources to speak of. And as an example of what I'm talking about, I take the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union in 1948 supported the partition of Israel and Palestine, and then a few years later they decided that it would be more strategic to be on the side of 19 Arab countries than on the side of Israel. So they had more support for the Arab side. And I would pose as an alternative thesis that at least in the United States Congress, the Israeli and the Jewish lobbies have been primarily responsible for the extent of U.S. support of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think there's a factual question there, which is not trivial to answer. As for the Soviet support of Israel, remember that the Soviet Union has always accepted a political settlement. They have always been right at the core of the international consensus. They have always taken the position that there should be a political settlement on the pre-June '67 borders, which recognizes the right of Israel to live in peace and security with secure and recognized boundaries. As far as I'm aware, there's never been any deviation from that in in Soviet policy. True, they have supported the Arab states, and they've done it for cynical reasons, you know, and all kind of awful things. But the fact of the matter is they have supported that settlement, and when the international consensus shifted, they shifted along with it. As for Israel having no oil, that's of course correct, but I don't think that's the issue. The issue was, could it serve as a strategic asset, as Henry Kissinger and Henry Jackson and others openly stated, and as U.S. policy developed. Now, you point out that the Jewish lobby had a big influence, and I agree. In fact, I sort of alluded to that, but in another form. I didn't refer to the Jewish lobby, but to the fact that there has been the articulate, educated part of the community has been overwhelmingly rejectionist since 1967. Not before that. Before 1967, most of the community, including even most of the Jewish community, didn't care very much about the issue. There was a big turn in 1967 after the Israeli victory. We can ask why, but there's no doubt that it happened. And since that time, there has been there's been a tremendous domestic lobby pressing for a rejectionist approach, for stalemate. Now, it includes what's called the Jewish lobby, but it is by no means restricted to it. It includes, as I said, Christian fundamentalists, who are a big force in the United States, and many of them are very anti-Semitic. It includes the top labor bureaucracy, which is part of it's Jewish, but not all. And it includes elements of the Pentagon, which are not Jewish at all. You know, they just like what the services that Israel performs. It includes lots of so-called neoconservative intellectuals who are not Jewish. They just happen to believe in, you know, the utility of violence and controlling the world, and this is a violent element, so it can do it for us. There's all kinds of elements that enter. And I agree that they have, my own feeling is they've had a swing effect, that there was a conflict between elites. And maybe, I don't know how much we disagree, but my view at least is that that conflict could have gone either way. And it went the way it did because of the strong, very articulate and organized domestic support, which was also extremely ugly and succeeded literally in intimidating most opposition, so people were afraid to open their mouths. That part I agree with, but I don't really think it was a Jewish lobby, to tell you the truth. Furthermore, I think, see, you can sort of test this, I think. See, I think that idea is based on a pluralist conception, which is not accurate. Ethnic lobbies can have effects, but only if they support a position which is supported by real power. And if you look at the history, you can see that. The effectiveness of the Jewish lobby, so-called, has varied depending on what U.S. policy is. So, for example, in 1956, when Israel attacked Egypt and conquered the Sinai, the United States was strongly opposed to that. Not because the United States had any opposition to Israel conquering the Sinai. When they did it in 1967, we supported it. The problem was that in 1956, they did it with the wrong allies. They did it together with our enemies, France and Britain, whom we had just expelled from the Middle East, so we could take over. And then Israel, France, and Britain came back together and invaded Egypt, and we were opposed to that. In fact, there was a point where we came rather close to going to war to stop our so-called allies from continuing with that. We threatened them, forced them to withdraw, and the U.S. government forced Israel to withdraw. All of that was done just prior to an American election, when you're supposed to be super politically sensitive, and nobody cared. It was just too important. And the effect of the Jewish lobby was virtually zero. They were just in conflict with real power, and therefore they disappeared. The same thing just happened in connection with this dialogue with the PLO. Up until December 14th, you look at the Jewish lobby, so-called, the presidents of the Jewish organizations and so on, they were militantly opposed to any dialogue with the PLO. You go to December 16th, they were all mostly in favor of it, saying very statesmanlike move on the part of our friend George Shultz and so on and so forth. U.S. policy shifted, so did the Jewish lobby. In fact, if you want my prediction, it's this. If U.S. policy actually turns against Israel, as it could, because I think it's, like the policy of any great power, totally cynical. If it does, what you're going to find is the Jewish lobby and the great articulate spokesmen who are sort of screaming about their love for Israel, they'll mostly be either hiding in the woodwork or supporting the new policy. And the people who are defending Israel will be people like me, who are opposed to the policy now and will be opposed to it then. That's what I would predict will happen. I can't see anything, so if somebody wants to talk.
Down here?
Yeah, okay, over there. Where are we? There? There?
Here?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to bring up the viability question. It's part of the idea that it's not so facile to solve the administration. I guess I don't see the U.S.'s role as being quite as economically oriented and cynical in this area. Secretary Schultz pointed out that the proposed Palestinian homeland ideas that have been tossed out aren't economically viable, and it would seem to me that the potential for another Northern Ireland sort of endless conflict still coming on after the establishment of a Palestinian homeland is definitely there. And I just wondered how you'd answer that.
Yeah. Well, George Shultz's statement that it's not economically viable we can dismiss. He knows nothing about the topic and he has no information about it. In fact, whether the Palestinian state would be viable or not depends on policy decisions. Israel's also not viable. I mean, Israel's total capital investment since 1948 is, I think, the total capital investment, last time I saw the figures, had come from the United States. Okay? So it's not viable, but it exists, you know, it functions because of the way it plays a role in international affairs and kind of support it gets and so on. As for a Palestinian state, in fact, most states are not viable. You know, abstractly, you know, they support if somebody they exist if somebody supports them or if they play a role and so on and so forth. Now, as far as the Palestinian state is concerned, there's close, careful analyses of it that you can look at if you like, and there are ways in which it could be viable, in fact, quite viable. The Palestinian population is very educated, very highly educated. It can become they have supplied much of the managerial and technical personnel for much of the Arab world. In fact, that's where a lot of their income comes from. It's quite possible that the Palestinian state could begin to play the role that Lebanon used to play. That is, the opening toward the West, the place where the banks are and where people can do business and so on and so forth. And it's entirely possible. I mean, of course, the Palestinian state could not survive unless it was supported by certainly Saudi Arabia, and the Arab world, but also was accepted, you know, into the system by Israel and the United States. In that case, there's every reason to believe it would be viable. I don't think that that's the problem that makes the solution difficult. The problems lie elsewhere. The problem is that if there is a Palestinian state, Israel's not viable. That's the real problem. And that problem has to do primarily with resources. And it has nothing to do with oil. It has to do with something that's a much more important resource in the arid Middle East, namely water. Much more important resource there. Nobody knows the details because they won't release the figures, but it seems as if approximately a third of Israel's water comes from the West Bank aquifers. You look at the hydrological structure of the place, there's one big sort of underground water supply, and it's large parts of it in the West Bank, and Israel's tapping it. That's one of the reasons they have not permitted the Arabs in the West Bank to dig deep wells. Only Israelis are allowed to dig deep wells. And as far as the Gaza Strip is concerned, it has basically no water resources. Israel has no more internal resources. Their own water is used to something like 100%. They can't get the Litani River, that river in southern Lebanon, which probably was one of the aims of the Lebanon War, because they were just driven out of Lebanon. There are big problems about the headwaters of the Jordan and all that sort of stuff. Unless some big technological discovery comes along, which at the moment nobody can dream of, you know, maybe some fantastic new technique of desalination or something. But as far as current prospects are concerned, there's basically no way for Israel to survive without West Bank water. That's the main thing. Secondary thing is that the West Bank is Israel's second largest market. It's a controlled market. You know, they don't let anything else in, and they don't let it develop, and they can just export to it. And furthermore, that gives them hard currency because, in effect, it amounts to trade with the Arab world, since hard currency comes in from the Arab states, and that's used to purchase Israeli goods and so on. That's a big loss if they lose it. They would also lose a cheap labor force, a very cheap, easily exploitable labor force. Now, maybe those latter two things can be compensated. Not easily, but maybe. It's the first one, it's not clear how it can be compensated for. And that's the real problem, I think. It's always been the problem. In fact, if you look at internal Israeli cabinet records, there's a lot of documentation on this. Unfortunately, it's all in Hebrew. But I have an article, if you're interested, which runs through some of the main stuff. There's a lot of this has been published in Hebrew. We have almost a day-to-day record of Israeli cabinet meetings from '67 through, I forget when it ends, sometime late '70s, roughly that. And they never raise any security problem. They barely talk about security. They don't even think of it as a problem, but they do talk about water. And because they understand that that's a serious problem. The United States understands it too. In fact, one of the constructive things that the United States did was back in the Eisenhower administration when they proposed a regional water system for the whole area. That made a lot of sense. It didn't get anywhere because Israel was opposed to it and it blew things up and so on and so forth. But the idea made sense. It's really an integrated region. And it's very hard to make an artificial division there that makes any sense. I mean, even if you just look at the place, you travel around that area, it simply makes no sense. Putting a border in there is senseless. You see it as soon as you walk there, and if you look at resources and so on, it makes no sense whatsoever. So in my view, a real two-state settlement is not and has never been viable. What is viable is some sort of federal settlement, some kind of federal arrangement which will involve an economic confederation and some abandonment of national sovereignty, as in any federation. I've always thought myself that that's the most viable solution, and I still think so. But look, it's not our business to impose solutions. It's our business to get the United States to stop blocking solutions. After we stop blocking them, they can figure out solutions.
Yeah, I find it hard to make the determination, so I will let you do it. To choose between asking about your comments on the second of the 3 points in terms of Arafat's so-called capitulation.
The right to exist one.
Yeah, you seem to take a long time about it as though you were yourself recognizing the semantic challenge.
I don't understand that. What I said is something pretty simple. No state in the world has a right to exist, or is granted a right to exist. States are granted the right to live in peace and security. That's a very crucial difference.
Yeah, in terms of the so-called capitulation.
If Arafat had accepted Israel's abstract right to exist, what he would have said is that the dispossession of the Palestinians not only took place, and not only that we recognize that it took place and accept it, but that we accept it as having been legitimate. And there's no reason in the world why I should say that. Nobody in the world says things like that, nor should they. I mean, you can say the world is the way it is. There's a state system, the borders are where they are, but anybody who says that those borders are right and just is immoral to the level of Nazism. There's no state border that I know of that's right and just. They just reflect past conquests. That's why Kissinger invented that term, because he was sure it would never be accepted. That was a way of blocking negotiations. It's an innovation in international affairs. There's no such thing. I can't see. I don't know if I understood your point. Maybe I didn't.
Yes, you did. You spoke to it again. I don't know if I should cheat and put in the other question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Your media has represented the Carter administration as a discontinuity with this unethical spreading of international terrorism through through American hiring, through American hiring of client states. But your scenario today represented the Carter administration as perpetrating this. I was wondering to what extent they both are true, or to what extent we should choose one over the other.
Well, if you look at the Carter administration, it's the only post-war administration that didn't use American forces, as far as we know, did not use American forces directly for international terrorism and aggression. So you could argue that if you want to sort of go by the standards of Nuremberg or something, that maybe Carter is the only president who shouldn't have been hanged by the standards of Nuremberg, arguably. On the other hand, the Carter administration did contribute and to support consciously and massively to large-scale violence. In fact, the Carter administration is primarily responsible for Indonesian terror, which is quite comparable to Pol Pot in those years. So maybe he ought to be hanged too. I don't know. It depends on your judgments. That's in the Indonesian invasion of Timor, primarily supported by the Carter administration. Now, it's true that the Carter administration had lots of talk about human rights being the soul of our foreign policy and all that kind of stuff. And that rhetoric was not without, I mean, in my view, that rhetoric was mostly cynical, but it was not without effect. You know, even cynical rhetoric sometimes has an effect. For example, it supported groups and other societies that were saying they have to use human rights considerations and may have saved lives indirectly. On the other hand, the Carter administration had to be dragged kicking and screaming to observe those human rights restrictions, which mostly came out of congressional legislation. And in fact, the reason they were in congressional legislation is because of the effect of the 60s. See, they don't tell you this, but the way it really worked is there was a big change in the United States in the 60s. There was a kind of a cultural revolution. You know, the country just became a lot more civilized. And one of the effects of that was that a lot of young people who came out of that experience, you know, they had those values, and some of them became congressional legislative assistants. Now, in Congress, the people with most of the brains are the legislative assistants. They do the thinking and work out the plans and so on, and then the congressmen read the statements. Congressional legislative assistants began to press for human rights measures, and some congressmen picked it up, maybe because they believed it or they thought it was useful or whatever. And Congress gradually instituted a human rights program, which is falsely called the Carter Human Rights Program. There are a lot of congressional legislation which the administrations, including the Carter administration, have found all sorts of ways of getting around that make it illegitimate to provide aid to to terrorist and murderous regimes and so on. On these grounds, all the aid to Israel is illegal. You know? I mean, you take a look at what Israel's been doing for 20 years, all the aid is illegal, and the same was true of most of the aid to other countries. Nevertheless, the Carter administration was somewhat different. It at least used the rhetoric, and that was not without effect. I mean, as I say, it strengthened just the rhetoric strengthened other groups who were working for human rights. Now, on the Middle East, the Carter administration, there was an interesting change. This has to do with the question about the Jewish lobby that somebody raised. As the Carter administration came into office, they came out, they looked as though they were going to change policy and come out in favor of a political settlement. Now remember, that was 1977, an important time, a year after the United States had vetoed the first UN resolution when other proposals were coming along. In October 1977, there was a joint Soviet-American statement, Carter-Brezhnev statement, which didn't call for a two-state settlement, but it came pretty close. It called for a political settlement which would preserve, you know, people's rights, lower the level of conflict, very positive resolution. Israel was very much opposed to it, bitterly opposed to it. The American lobby, which I don't think is a Jewish lobby, I repeat, but the American lobby was very much opposed to it. Carter was bitterly attacked for having made that statement. The American media were quite interesting. Typically, when the U.S. government is in conflict with some other state, the president is given primary, you know, he gets the first cup, the issue is framed in terms of the U.S. position. So you turn on the tube, and there's the president talking, and, you know, then a bunch of people say how right he is, and so on. And then in the interest of fairness, you know, after the ads and sports and so on, somebody else, the other side, is allowed a couple of words. In this case, it was reversed. Actually, there's an interesting book about this, if you're interested, by Montague Kearns. I think it's a woman who, it's from the Georgetown Middle East Studies Center or something. She just analyzed media coverage in detail, and it's kind of striking. The Israeli political leadership got the front, and Carter was in the background. He had to sort of, you know, apologize and so on. That's kind of intriguing, you know, and I don't think that's the Jewish lobby. I think that's the general educated community, which had already taken a very strongly rejectionist position, and Carter was considered sort of a traitor to that position. In fact, he backed off. The pressure was enough so that Carter backed off from what looked like an initiative. And after that, there was no further deviation that I know of.
I'm going to have to interrupt. This will have to be the last question for this afternoon's lecture program. However, Professor Chomsky is going to be talking this evening at 7 p.m. in the same place on manufacturing consent, the political economy of the mass media. So if we could have the last question and try to keep it brief. We have to whisk Professor Chomsky off to another engagement, but he'll be back at 7. Thanks.
One more question somewhere?
I got one here.
Yeah, go ahead.
The uprising, the Intifada, was not started by the PLO, and they were even surprised by it, and they probably cannot even stop it. But what do you think of the PLO's role in sustaining the Intifada?
I think, well, you know, this is a tricky business, but as far as I can make out, in part from the documentation, in part from having been there and traveled around the villages and talking to organizers and so on, my impression is that I think, first of all, I think the Intifada is misdescribed. It's not a matter of people throwing stones. There's a major social revolution going on there. I mean, there's a real social revolution taking place in Palestinian society. The remnants of the feudal structures are being overcome. I mean, relations between men and women are changing, you know, between young and old are changing. The whole business is just changing radically. It's a very large-scale popular social revolution of a very interesting type. And the idea that the PLO initiated this is outlandish. In fact, they don't even understand it. What the PLO role is trying to capitalize on it as best they can. In fact, if you travel around the West Bank, as I did, and you talk to local grassroots activists and organizers, they have a lot of contempt for the PLO. They don't like it much, but they are committed to it. They say, that's our political leadership. We may not like it, they may be corrupt, they may be stupid or whatever, but if you want to have a political settlement, you talk to those guys. Meanwhile, we'll carry out our social revolution here. If there ever is a political settlement, my own guess is there's going to be a real conflict between the PLO bureaucracy and the domestic population in the occupied territories. And that's my strong suspicion. But I suspect that the PLO doesn't know very much about what's going on. In fact, to tell you the honest truth, I also had the feeling that the Palestinian intellectuals in the cities in the West Bank didn't have much of an idea what was going on. Now, that's not a deep impression. It's a relatively superficial impression, but it's the one I got from being there. And if it's true, it wouldn't surprise me very much. I don't think the people in Manhattan have very much idea what's going on in Harlem. You know, you don't know what's going on in your own society, typically. You know what's going on in your own social circles. But in any class-ridden, you know, sex-ridden, etc. society, most people don't know what's going on. They have all sorts of misconceptions based on the, you know, power and hierarchy and so on. What's going on in the villages is what it is, and I suspect that the Palestinian intellectuals in the cities, for the most part, don't know what it is. And I don't think the Israeli intelligence has any idea what it is. There are a few Israeli writers. There's one woman named Shulamit Har-Even, a very good novelist, incidentally. Some of her novels are translated in English, but she's been following it closely. She speaks Arabic, she goes to the villages, talks to people. She's written a lot of stuff in the Hebrew press, and in fact, if you want a recent article of hers was just translated into English. It's a good article. It appears in a kind of dovish journal called New Outlook, which I suspect the library probably has. It's in either the latest issue or the next to latest issue. And it's a translation of an article, one of the several articles of hers in which she describes what you see in the villages when you go. And I think her perception is very accurate. It's exactly what I saw at less depth than she does. And I think, you know, like in a lot of social revolutions, I think people don't understand it who look from the outside or who look from the elite point of view and so on. That's been true throughout history, and I think it's true here.
You've been watching Part 3, the conclusion of Noam Chomsky's March 15, 1989 presentation, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, a PDxJustice Voices from the Archive lecture. In a moment, we'll turn to a commentary on the lecture by Professor Bashir Abu-Meneh. Our speaker is Noam Chomsky, Professor of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Among his many publications, he is author of Middle East Illusions, which includes his earlier work, Peace in the Middle East, Reflections on Justice and Nationhood. The Fateful Triangle, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians, and 9/11, a collection of interviews published in the aftermath of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. To find out more about Noam Chomsky and his work in linguistics and as analyst and critic of U.S. foreign policy, please visit his website at www.chomsky.info. Originally, this final segment was to include commentary by several Palestinian and Jewish activists involved in the struggle for a just resolution to the conflict in Palestine-Israel. In place of several shorter commentaries, a longer segment, a single interview, has been chosen to conclude this program. Assistant Professor of English at Barnard College, Bashir Abu Maneh, teaches courses in global literature, Palestinian and Israeli literatures, Marxism, and post-colonialism. The interview took place in his office at Barnard College in Manhattan on April 1, 2007. And now, Professor Bashir Abu Maneh.
Well, I thought it was a very important lecture, still very relevant to understanding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Arab-Israeli conflict for that matter, and more broadly, the U.S. role in the region. Two main things that come to mind that I always felt were generally Chomsky territory, as it were, in trying to understand international relations of the Middle East. One very important dimension of the argument has always been for him to try to understand the main cause of why the U.S. is in the region, why the U.S. came into the region, why the U.S. has been involved in the region since 1940. And I think this has always been his emphasis, that the U.S. is there to control oil. Not to control oil because it needs it, but to control oil because it, using that, tries to determine the policies and the accumulation strategies of its allies, Japan and Europe. So that has been there and constant since the 1940s. Out of that, out of this primary, initial, foundational U.S. cause for U.S. presence in the region, comes out hostility to nationalist regimes. And from that period, from 40s, 50s onwards, when the older, greater powers evacuate the conflict, the area, the U.S. moves more in and gets more and more hold of the region. A very important indicator is the 1956 war, where, and in relationship to the behavior of the Israelis, it's a very important indicator if we compare it with the 1967 war. In 1956, Israel attacked Egypt in coordination with England, the UK, and France. And the Eisenhower's response was very clear and very important, and he said Israelis should evacuate Sinai. And of course, Ben Gurion started shouting about Al-Arish being Jewish land and all of that, and Eisenhower was very firm. He said Israel has to leave Sinai. Israel left Sinai and left Gaza as well. Exactly because Israel attacked without either prior U.S. knowledge or without U.S. consideration in order to serve other U.S. allies in the region. The 1967 war was done with U.S. coordination and with a green light from the U.S. exactly in order to serve U.S. interests in the region. So it was much more in alliance with the U.S. then. Much more in coordination with the U.S. then, cemented later on the U.S.-Israel alliance. Now, it's important in relationship to oil because that 67 war, very importantly, ended up crushing Arab nationalism politically. So out of the oil concerns comes a hostility towards the U.S., and into that is inserted the Israeli role. Israeli role, I think, foundationally, very important, is premised on what Chomsky says, very importantly, the strategic asset thesis, that Israel has played since 1967 a strategic role in U.S. regional policy. And the most crucial part of it is not in protecting oil. I don't think that's what Israel is there for. I think the U.S. in and of itself can do that on its own much more important than U.S. directly. First Iraq war is an example of that. The second Iraq war, the 2003 war, is an example of that, where the U.S. doesn't actually need Israel to actively protect or go in and control the oil itself. What the U.S. needs Israel for is to try to crush Arab nationalism, to try to push back any kind of Arab radicalism or any kind of move to independent political regimes, popular political regimes. So to keep the Arabs ruled by, maintain authoritarian elite rulership over the Arabs, which was very, very amenable for U.S. primacy in the region. Saudi Arabia is a very favorite regime for the U.S. The Egyptian regime, after Sadat's peace treaty, becomes a very important regime in that sense. The Jordanian regime has always been important. One thing you can say about this, which Chomsky has always emphasized, is that the Egyptian case is a very interesting case in its changing response to the US in the region. After the 1967 war, something very interesting happens in Egypt. Egypt recognizes that for it to return the Sinai region and for it to return its national rights violated by Israel in the 1967 war, it has to not pursue its Soviet alliance, but actually move towards the US. And there are peace overtures by Sadat, very importantly, from the early 1971 onwards. Endless overtures, endless interviews saying that if we don't return our lands by peace with Israel, we are interested in peace, we're happy to settle the conflict based on land for peace formula, we're happy to settle with the Israelis. The Israelis, of course, refused that. If we don't get that by the peace route, we will do it by force. And that's what happened in 1971 onwards, and by 1973, Egypt initiated the war in order to return Sinai in coordination with Syria. Syria wanted to return the Golan Heights. It is then that the US awakens and realizes that Egypt is a very important strategic. It takes a war for Kissinger to recognize how significant and how really ruffled and angry Egypt was about the Israeli occupation of Sinai. So Egypt can force the US by the power of war to change its policy over Sinai. So the US comes in after the 1973 war and tries to settle the Egyptian-Israeli conflict very specifically. And Sadat comes in to effectively say that if Israel if Israel returns Sinai, we will have peace with the Israelis. And that way, recognizing that he could only get Sinai back not through the Soviets but through the Americans. The other interesting issue about the Egyptians, and there's an interesting comparison with the Palestinians over this issue, is that because Egypt is such a powerful state, Egypt could actively do it by force. Right? It could attack Israel. It could try to get back its national rights by force. For the Palestinians, because they're so weak, because they don't have the capacity that the Egyptian state has, they couldn't force themselves onto the attention of the Americans for them to sufficiently put pressure on Israel to settle the conflict. The problem of capacity or lack of capacity for the Palestinians has been one of their major problems in the region. That's why Egypt can return its rights and the Palestinians couldn't. The lecture was given in 1989. This was the time when the Palestinians were in active, spontaneous and popular revolt against the Israeli occupation. And it brings us back to that very important moment, I think, when the Palestinians were closest to ever trying to achieve national self-determination. What comes out of this moment, mass, again, spontaneous, what Chomsky calls actually a revolutionary mobilization by the Palestinians to overcome their subjugation by the Israelis since 1967. What comes out of this is a formalization, a consolidation of a Palestinian peace initiative, right? Ratified officially in 1988, in November 1988, and accepted, as he says, on 14th of December 1988. The world is always looking for, they say the Palestinians don't have a Mandela. Right? This is the time, 1998, when they had a Palestinian Mandela. The Palestinians recognized Israel's right to live in peace and security, very important distinction, not recognize Israel's right to exist, but to live in peace and security. Recognized that, became accepted officially the international consensus over resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which they have implicitly accepted, arguably since 1974, when they accepted to build a Palestinian state on any liberated part of Palestine. This was ratified again in 1988. So the parameters, had the US been interested, and had the Israelis been interested, the parameters for settling or beginning to settle the Palestinian-Israeli conflict were there. This is what the Intifada was about. This is what the 1988 peace overtures were about. And the fact that we're still here now and that this hasn't been accepted just shows you the extent to which Israel is completely a rejectionist of Palestinian right of self-determination. And the Americans have been completely rejectionists of Palestinian right of self-determination as well. This is the significant point at which the conflict could have been over effectively. We're talking 20 years ago, if not before. If only for the fact that Israel and the US don't want it to be over. And that this is another important Chomsky emphasis, and that they are the exception in the world. They have always been the two most important countries who rejected the international consensus over the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So they're outside of the international consensus. Most people in the US believe in that consensus. Most people actually in Israel arguably believe that you can only achieve peace with the Palestinians if you return all of the West Bank and Gaza. A significant part of Israelis believe that you have to settle the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In Gaza, certainly, and in the West Bank, less of a majority, but nonetheless a very significant part of Israelis believe that you have to settle the Palestinian-Israeli conflict by evacuating all the settlements, which are perceived to be illegal. This is what the international consensus didn't want to. Now, because the Palestinians were weak in terms of capacity, even important point in 1988 and 1989, when peace could have been achieved, again, but wasn't because Israel didn't want to. And the US didn't want to. Now, because the Palestinians were weak in terms of capacity, even their revolt couldn't achieve what a powerful state like Egypt did in 1973, right? What Chomsky talks about is that the US had to adjust its policies, its consistent strain of rejecting Palestinian national determination by having a dialogue with Arafat. So you have Palestinian Mandela coming into shape in 1988, and the American concession is only to have a dialogue with the Palestinians. Right? That's a very important difference with the South African case. Right? Where the South African case, there was a Mandela, and that generated a completely different set of political outcomes. In the Palestinian case, the Palestinians have always, at least since the mid-70s, that has been the Fatah strain, been interested in settling with the Israelis by having a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, ending the occupation, and beginning to resolve the Palestinian question. It's just the Israelis didn't want that. The Israelis continued to hold on to the West Bank and Gaza, continued to build settlement, continued having a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And this has always been having a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And this has always been the impediment for peace. So Chomsky has always recognized that, and this is very important, and has always, I think a majority of Americans understand that this is what the parameters of the beginning of a just resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli question is about. It's just that the American elites and their cheerleaders in the media don't. That has always been the problem. That has always been why the Palestinian question seems so difficult to talk about in the US, and why the Palestinian question has been completely mystified in the US, talking about either Palestinians as a bunch of terrorists, or either invoking notions of the ancient hatreds between the Jews and the Muslims. These are simply irresolvable. This is just complete nonsense. The conflict is resolvable. It's just that Israel and the US don't want to resolve it, because the Palestinians are too weak enough to enforce a resolution on them. And that's always been a very important. And that's always been a very important amongst pre-war priested, or sometimes thinks back to a very important humanist, he calls it humanist, somewhat binationalist stand amongst pre-war, pre-1948 Jewish issue. But the people who actively found labor Zionists, in the group in and around Ben Gurion, within the Zionist camp, were what you can call the who actively founded the State of Israel. And the State of Israel, and this is when actively founded the State of Israel. And the State of Israel, and this is when talking about Zionism in hypothetical terms, this was the dispossession of the Palestinians. They talk about what Zionism meant in terms of policies. What Zionism meant in terms of policies, and what's very unique about Israel and Zionism as a foundation of the State of Israel involved the end of Palestinian society, effectively. A complete denial of Palestinian self-determination. And what's very unique about Israel and Zionism as a settler colonial ideology is, unlike the South African case, where the South Africans sought to exploit the natives, the Zionists sought to completely dispense with them. They were completely, they sought to expel them. So natives have no place within the structure of the new entity that comes into place with the settler colonial project taking. Puts the black South Africans in positions to achieve certain political outcomes which are much more difficult for the Palestinians to do, because they're completely evacuated out of the structure. So they have very little leverage to transform Zionism or Israel from within, like the black South Africans did. So for example, if it's much easier for the black South Africans to go for a one-state solution, exactly because they're placed within the structure, effectively, let's call it a one-state solution, it's much more difficult for the Palestinians. However desirable it is, it's much more difficult for the Palestinians, exactly because Zionism entailed their expulsion in 1948. And this was one of the foundational moments for the Palestinians. The fact that they were completely cut out of the structure of the new state that came into being based on the destruction of their own society. So part of the problem of Palestinian nationalism is how to substitute for this lack of leverage within the society you're trying to transform. What can the Palestinians do to gain the power and capacity, right? Very importantly, to transform the situation? It's a much more difficult national struggle, I think. It's a much more difficult national struggle, I think. And the Palestinians have dealt with a much more uncompromising enemy in the form of the Zionists than the black South Africans ended up doing, facing, I think. So the situation on the ground today, arguably, if we want to keep very briefly to this comparison with South Africa, is much worse than what the South Africans experienced in South Africa before. Exactly because of this foundational difference between the two kinds of settler colonialisms. Now, the other dimension of this Zionism, which was very important, the Zionism that founded the state, was that it was Zionism based on labor movements. That it was Zionism that was pushed through not by Jewish capitalists. Jewish capitalists actually failed in settling Palestine, very importantly. The people who succeeded in settling Palestine were the bureaucracy that ended up organizing the labor organizations in Palestine. So that you have a settler, very uniquely, a settler colonial project being pushed through by labor organization, the Histadrut and the Yishuv military wing combined together. Incorporating into that support from the Jewish capitalists, but the project being driven and organized by this bureaucratic elite through the labor organizations. That, of course, has meant that another important outcome is that there was very little room within Palestine, within pre-1948 Palestine and afterwards, for what you can call cross-national organizations with the Palestinians. That's why the most foundational antagonism between the Palestinians and the Israelis has always been a national antagonism. Room for other kinds of political formations or coordination was very narrow, if not completely unavailable or completely impossible, exactly because of the nature of the Zionist project being driven by the labor organizations. So these are very important features that are specific to Zionists. The other third important feature, one is the dispensability of the natives, the other is being pushed by labor organizations. The third very important feature is that Zionism has been, since its Herzlian days, constitutively aligned a state, a Jewish state in Palestine without the support, a Jewish state in Palestine without the support subsidy of the British. You couldn't have had, arguably, I think, an imperial support and sponsorship, right? That's another important feature of Zionism, without American support and subsidy for that. So that the Zionist project in foundation and in expansion is premised on Western support and imperial support and sponsorship. Right? That's another important feature of Zionism, another important feature of the State of Israel. Right? These are things that mark it off as a settler colonialism than from other kinds of settler colonialism. Now, I think about this project, if we look at it in more in a broader historical perspective, is that the exclusion of the Palestinian natives was attenuated. There was a partial exception to that in the period from 1967 to 1987 in the areas of the West Bank and Gaza, where effectively Israel behaved like an imperial exploitative power, thought to exploit the Palestinian cheap labor. And they were brought into the Israeli market on a migratory daily basis. They were never allowed to stay inside Israel, but they were brought in unexploited. So when the Intifada happened, exactly because the Palestinians were allowed to inside Israel, exactly because they were the cheap labor of Israel, Israel was very much shaken by the Intifada. It gave them a lot more political leverage when they decided to revolt, their presence within the economy. And what people like Rabin instituted in 1991, and that was officially on the books from March. Partial exception to Zionist dispensability of the natives. Partial exception to Zionist dispensability of the natives, being constitutive to Zionism, was ended. And what was brought back in is cutting out of the Palestinians completely from any kind of relationship within the Israeli Zionist structures, labor structures, and other kinds of economic structures, and so forth. That effectively means that from 1993 onwards, the Palestinians, it's much more difficult for the Palestinians to put pressure, any kind of pressure on Israel. Much more difficult for the Palestinians to have any way of access to Israeli society. They were completely cut off, collectively punished. The policy of closure was instituted in 1993 onwards. And the Palestinians were in a much weaker position than they were before the Intifada to try to transform Israel. The policy of closure was instituted as a result of the Intifada. This was that were instituted by Rabin to try to crush the Intifada. That were instituted by Rabin to try to crush the Intifada. And they became part of what the Oslo framework was about. So that the Oslo moment actually, very importantly, Palestinian independence, and these are completely uncontroversial claims. Palestinian independence, and these are completely uncontroversial claims. No end of settlements, no end of occupations, no Palestinian state. A pretty clear understanding of what Oslo was about. No end of settlements, no end of occupations, no Palestinian state. But where it left the Palestinians actually is in a position much closer to Native Americans, where the population is completely dispensable for Israel, lies completely outside of its structures, and therefore extremely vulnerable to being cut off, cantonized, put in Palestinian townships, if you want to. Extremely vulnerable to being cut off, cantonized, put in Palestinian townships, if you want to call them townships. They're even much worse than townships. Put in closed off in zones that are circled around by the wall, so the Palestinians can simply stay there and effectively rot without having any kind of point of pressure, access, or trying to transform Israeli society.
Includes part 3, the final part of the lecture program, The United States.
Kinds of comparisons that come into mind, and I think Norman Finkelstein has been very important in raising that issue early on in the first Palestinian Intifada, was now that what the way things are heading for the Palestinians they're looking more and more like Native Americans.
This concludes part 3, the final part of the lecture program, The United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. Parts 1 and 2 of this lecture are available as streaming video through our website at www.org. You'll find broadcast dates for this and other programs on March 15, 1989. For more information about this and other PDX Justice Media Productions programs, please visit ORG. You'll find broadcast dates for this and other programs .org. You'll find broadcast dates for this and other programs and links to additional resources for learning more about the conflict in Israel-Palestine. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots democratic community media.